If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the business of lifelong learning, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
And I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
Welcome to episode 221 of the Leading Learning Podcast, in which we welcome Rohit Bhargava back to the show. Many listeners will be familiar with Rohit, but if you're not, he is probably best known as a curator of non-obvious trends and the author of the Non-Obvious series of books that he has issued annually since 2011. Jeff, we've each had the opportunity to talk with Rohit before on the podcast. What do you cover with him this time around?
Well, as you mentioned, Rohit has been publishing his Non-Obvious series of books since 2011. So the big headline for this episode is that 2020 brings us to the 10th edition. And this time around, Rohit has done something a bit different. He's calling this one Non-Obvious Megatrends. And in it, he essentially looks at the trajectory of the past trends he's identified, combines that with what he's seeing right now and what he describes as the accelerating present. And he identifies 10 really big trends that he thinks will impact us in the coming decade. And so naturally, we talk about some of those trends, but we also talk about the whole non-obvious project and how it's evolved over the years. Non-Obvious is no longer just a book series. In fact, this will be the last of the books. Really, it has become a whole way of thinking. And of course, it's become a company that offers a range of different ways to help people and businesses embrace and leverage that way of thinking.
Well, it's been really interesting to see the Non-Obvious project evolve over the years. Jeff, you and I know firsthand that one of the ways Rohit has taught people about non-obvious thinking over the years is as a really engaging keynote speaker. And I'll use that as a lead-in to call out a non-obvious aspect of the Leading Learning website that we want to highlight as a resource. Namely, whenever we have someone on the show like Rohit, who is a speaker, we tag that episode. What that means is that it's then very easy for you to find and listen to the various speakers who have been on the show simply by going to leadinglearning.com/tag/speaker. And we'll also make sure, of course, to link to that in the show notes. So if you happen to work for an organization that has need of speakers, and we know many listeners do, this is a great way to review a range of options and get a feel for a speaker's content and style. Now, we know that when Rohit speaks, he gets people thinking and reflecting. So what thought-provoking questions do you have to offer up from the conversation with him, Jeff?
Well, I have two questions to offer, or more accurately, I guess, clusters of questions. First, I'll pose an obvious one. We highlight 3 of the megatrends in our conversation, and those are instant knowledge, attention wealth, and ungendering. And I challenge listeners to really put some thought into how those particular megatrends might impact their learning businesses. Now, the second one, on a less obvious note, we talk about the whole non-obvious project and how that's evolved. And as you mentioned, Rohit does a great deal of speaking. The company offers workshops. It's gotten into publishing and, spoiler alert, it's headed for podcasting. And, basically Rohit and his team took a core idea and turned it into an entire business that has spawned multiple products. So the question is, how are you leveraging and capitalizing upon your best ideas? What might those results look like a decade from now?
Well, those are very good questions, and we will, of course, link to them in the show notes at leadinglearning.com/episode 221. We'll also link to the 3 previous episodes with Rohit, along with other resources related to non-obvious thinking. In the meantime, though, let's move ahead with the latest conversation with Rohit Bhargava.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeff Cobb. This is the Leading Learning Podcast, and today I'm joined by Rohit Bhargava. Rohit is an innovation and marketing expert and the founder of the Non-Obvious Company. He spent 15 years as a marketing strategist for Ogilvy and Leo Burnett, is the Wall Street Journal best-selling author of 6 business books, and also teaches marketing and innovation at Georgetown University. Now, Rohit has joined us on the show before. In fact, this is his 4th time, which I think may put him in first place for most appearances on Leading Learning. This time he's back to discuss his most recent book, Non-Obvious Megatrends, which I view as a sort of capstone to the very popular Non-Obvious series that he's published over the past decade. And we'll talk about that book in detail. We'll also talk about where things are going with the whole Non-Obvious project. But first, Rohit, welcome back to Leading Learning.
Thanks, Jeff. It's elite company, I suppose, being back here talking to you. So I'm really excited.
Oh yeah, one of the few and one of the proud. But we're glad to have you back because wow, this is it's a big event. It's hard. I think we caught you maybe around year 5 or so of the Non-Obvious books. This is now your 10th year, 10th edition. It's hard for me to believe that you've been at it for a decade. I'm sure it's hard for you to believe you've been at it that long. Yeah, and. I know many of our listeners will have tuned in before, whether here or in other places, and have read the books or familiar with your work. But I don't want to assume too much before we get into the conversation. I do want to make sure we catch up anyone who may not be fully familiar with what you've been up to, or who just needs a refresher at this point. So, I guess the first big question I'll pose then is, what exactly have you been up to for the past decade?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question because you're right. I mean, sometimes people will know and they won't. And I think that the big mission for me, really over the last decade, has been to try and encourage more people to be what I call non-obvious thinkers. And really, what I mean by that is someone who thinks for themselves, who isn't narrow-minded, who takes time to appreciate perspectives who aren't that don't match with their own. And honestly, what's happened over the last 10 years, which has been fascinating and concerning, is that is really, really hard because of all of these algorithms that just serve up the exact same news that you already agree with, how polarized the media environment has become and how low trust everything seems, and people just are skeptical. And so this message that I used to put out there as a way of just saying, here are some trends that can help you grow your business or just be smarter, I feel like it's kind of become a more urgent call to action to say, look, this is changing our world. Like, we need more people who can be objective and less opinionated. And so that's kind of become this big mission of this series.
It's funny you mentioned the urgency there, because that's something I wanted to ask you about, is whether you felt like the urgency was growing, because it certainly seems to me like it is, and of course I guess that's reflected in what you're doing now, because this used to be you put out these certain number of trends annually, and I've always appreciated that you give a lot of guidance on sort of your process and how people can use those trends, but you're starting to move beyond that, it sounds like. And I think, I assume it's because the need is really moving beyond that. And I'll point out something I noticed in the book this time, and maybe it was there before, and maybe I was just more primed to notice it this time. But you suggest that your whole sort of non-obvious process, the non-obvious way of thinking, is really akin to an approach to lifelong learning. And I'm sure that will really resonate with listeners here. Could you say a little bit more about that, the whole lifelong learning, non-obvious thinking, how those fit together?
Yeah, it really does. It really is. I mean, I tend to use a lot of stories and analogies, as you know. And so one of the things that I often talk about is that the smartest people that I know are the ones who find a way to collect ideas the same way most of us collect frequent flyer miles. And the reason why I use that analogy is, if you think about it, if you fly, if you or I flew from New York to LA and we got whatever 2,500 miles or whatever it is, we wouldn't turn around the next day and say, okay, how do I use my 2,500 miles? I mean, you can't go anywhere, right? You got to build them up over time, over multiple trips, before you then cash them in to go somewhere that you want to go. And I think if we could do that with our ideas, A, we would get better at collecting them and figuring out how to save them. And B, we'd start thinking about what are the relationships between these ideas. And that's really a big part of this process that you talked about. I mean, I have a name for it, and it's a 5-step method, and I teach it in a lot of these workshops and talk about it in the keynotes, right? But the point of the method is just to say to people that, look, there's no magic trick that I know as a quote-unquote futurist where you should just pay me to tell you what the trends are because you can't do it for yourself. I don't believe that. I think that anyone can teach themselves how to do these things in the right way to be able to see those connections for themselves.
Well, and as you've noted, and I've noted as well, you have methods, you have processes around this. You talk a lot about curation. You have your haystack method, and I'm thinking we won't dig a lot into those in this interview because you have been on 3 times at this point. We have actually dug into those quite a bit, and we will link folks to past interviews, and of course, this book and all of your books themselves are great resources for really understanding the process, understanding how curation happens. So, definitely want readers to go back, check out those past interviews, check out the books themselves, and check out this year's book. Before we actually get to the key ideas, trends of this year's book, though, because we are now at this decade point, and if my understanding is correct, you're not really going to publish this kind of trends book anymore. I do want to talk a little bit about the past. You've been doing it for a long time. Are there trends that you've identified during the course of your decade of working on this that still really stand out for you? And that might be because of their overall impact or their staying power. I mean, however you want to approach it. Are there some that you just think, wow, I'm really glad that we managed to focus in on that one?
There definitely are. I think for context, one of the things that might be interesting for your listeners, especially the ones who've heard some of the previous shows, is what's different this year from previous years. Because, like you said, I mean, it's been a 10-year project. And really what that has meant is every year there's a new quote unquote trend report, which has 15 trends that, based on the research that I and my team do, will affect how we think, what we buy, what we sell, how we learn in the coming year. And so the lens has always been a year. And in fact, the cover of the book has always had a year on it, like the Guinness Book of World Records, right? It's like non-obvious 2019 or non-obvious 2018. And this year, what's different is, yes, it's the 10th year, so it's the 10-year anniversary. It's the last year, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's also non-obvious megatrends. And the horizon is not just the next year. The horizon is the next decade. And so what that really caused me to do with this editorial team that I've got is look back over the last 10 years and say, look, what are the trends that stood out? And what are the commonalities between them? And how do we elevate our thinking even higher? And so at the end of each megatrend chapter in this new book, there's a roadmap of all of the past trend predictions from 2011 until 2019 that weighed into this particular megatrend. And so there's a huge backdrop of stories, examples, insights, research that go into each one of these megatrends to really try and elevate each one.
Well, and I love it that you do that. And in fact, I love that your books tend to just be so practical in general, and that's maybe a topic I want to come back to. But the fact that you lay out these megatrends, you give a snapshot of the megatrends, you show how the past trends you've identified flow into those megatrends. You give some ways that people can put the trends to use. I mean, just kudos on that. I think I read very few books that are as useful as yours tend to be. I think that's definitely something to call out. And I mean, we're not going to have time in the context of today's podcast to discuss every one of the megatrends, but I mean, for the record, I will at least name them here, and then I'm hoping maybe we can highlight. We'll see how many of them we manage to dig a little deeper into, but I'll just tick them off here. They are amplified identity, ungendering, instant knowledge, revivalism, human mode, attention wealth, purposeful profit, data abundance, protective tech, and flux commerce. And I'm betting, obviously, that's, a word or two on each of the trends. I'm betting even just hearing those, though, they probably resonate with people. They've got a sense of where you might be going with some of these areas that you've identified. But let's maybe, try to talk about a few of them in a little bit more depth here. And I know I have one that I'd like to identify, and then maybe, it'd be good to hear if you have one or two that you really want to call out. But the one that particularly jumped out at me was instant knowledge. And your sort of one sentence on that is, as we become accustomed to consuming bite-sized knowledge on demand, we benefit from learning everything more quickly, but risk forgetting the value of mastery and wisdom. And I feel like that's one that certainly the folks who are listening to this podcast should be paying attention to. Can you talk a little bit more about instant knowledge as a megatrend?
Yeah, this has been a huge one, and actually one that's probably been one of the more popular of the megatrends so far in conversations that I've had, because it really resonates for people, right? I mean, you can go on, people generally know that you can go onto YouTube and figure out how to fix a leak in your toilet. You can go to some of these platforms and learn how to play the banjo from Steve Martin. I mean, there's all of these ways of learning now, and the positive side of it is we have access to world-class experts and all of this great content that is really on demand, which is awesome. The challenge is that if we can get exactly what we need without ever having to learn the foundation behind it, we risk having just superficial knowledge. And sometimes instant knowledge becomes superficial knowledge that is good for solving a problem or doing something quickly, but not that good for anything longer term. And I know that this is a big topic, at least in the way that I think about teaching as a educator myself, but also in anyone who works in any level of education or learning, because it raises this question of, like, how deep do we need to go, right? Do we need the 1-hour seminar? Do we need the 5-day intensive course? Do we need this full certificate program? Do we need all three, depending on who's consuming that information? Do we need it in multiple chunks? All of these questions, I think, are just so fascinating, because what it leads us to, particularly with this megatrend, is what I think the reality of any predictions like this are, which is it describes something that's changing in our world, but it isn't inherently good or bad. The question is, how are we going to actually use it to think differently or do things differently?
And it seems like there's the possibility that we're going to lose depth, we're going to lose mastery, as you said. There's also, and I believe you bring this up in a different part of the book, but it seems related to me, kind of basically a processing problem that we have right now. And I'm gonna read a passage that you have earlier in the book where it says, the problem is that expecting to get smarter from processing content faster is a bit like entering a speed eating contest to enjoy a good meal. Eating 26 hot dogs in 60 seconds might satisfy your hunger, but you're likely to feel sick afterwards. And it feels like we're kind of in danger of that with this instant knowledge access that we have. I think there can be this temptation to, can I just process quicker, and keep up with the machines, basically.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite quotes that I share early in the book is from the famous science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, who said, "I'm not a speed reader, I'm a speed understander." And I think we spend a lot of time trying to become or encourage others to become speed readers. And the idea of speed reading is you consume everything, you just consume it faster.
Right.
Whereas the idea of speed understanding is you consume what you need to in order to develop understanding. And I love that idea so much more.
Yeah, I think it has a lot more value, particularly in today's world. Now, you said that instant knowledge is one that seems to be, already feeling popular with folks. What are some of the other ones that have resonated the most as you've started to put the book out there?
I will say another one that's really resonated for people because it speaks to the idea of attention is the attention wealth megatrend. And attention wealth is sort of a megatrend that is in response to something we all know and have heard lots and lots of times, which is that we're in this information economy, right? And in an information economy, the currency is your attention. And that's not a new idea. It's not like I'm the first person to say that, right? You probably heard it many times. But if our attention is actually the currency, then why aren't we considered wealthy? Because we have the ability to control our attention, right? And what I started to think about and write about in this megatrend is when our attention is the most valuable thing that we have to offer, and when organizations who are trying to engage us, right, and engagement is a big word in the marketing world that I come from, when they're all trying to engage us and capture that attention and use it, and they have all this data to be able to understand what we care about and what we spend attention, or what we spend our time and attention on, we should be able to use our attention to generate value for ourselves. So, for example, what I mean by that is the more data. So a lot of people wear Fitbits, right? And the nice thing about a Fitbit is it can encourage you to kind of get up and move around and get your number of steps, your arbitrary number of steps, right? Why 10,000? Nobody knows, but it's 10,000, and that's what people aim for. And hey, it's better than sitting around, right? But now a lot of people have started to wonder and complain. They say, look, I have all this healthcare data, technically, right? My steps, but it doesn't connect with my actual healthcare. But I have this data, and I'm generating it by everything that I'm doing. And what happens eventually, and I believe this is going to happen very soon in this new decade, when people start figuring out that, look, I have access to all this data that I've created, and there's value in that data, because if a company could use that data, they could deliver something to me of value if I'm willing to share it. And so now I have the control over this data in a way that it used to be data is just collected on me. But more and more you're seeing, like with new privacy laws coming out in California saying that certain data has to be available to the consumer. Most people may not do this, but there's a button on Facebook where you can literally export everything you've ever posted to Facebook and get it back yourself. And so more and more this data is being handed back to us in some ways. The problem is we just don't know how to use it yet.
Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to us figuring that out. I'm a bit of a fanatical tracker of my own health data, so but yeah, I have not managed to connect the dots fully into how that really creates value for me and where it fits into overall value around health. Now, one I want to ask about, and I'm basically taking a cue from you and doing this and going somewhere that for listeners here may be a bit. Well, I think it probably is non-obvious, may not be where they're focusing, so a little bit more divergent thinking, trying to think, outside of where they might normally be putting their efforts, and that's this mega trend of ungendering. Because I'm sure the listeners here, are tuned into what's going on with gender out there, but they may not be thinking about that in the context of their business, of being a lifelong learning, continuing education provider. And I know you're all about, how do you actually apply these trends, these mega trends in your actual business environment? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, a mega trend like ungendering for a business that's focused on this whole market for lifelong learning?
Yeah, I think ungendering is a really fascinating one, because what it says is something a little bit different than maybe what we're all thinking or hearing about, right? So a lot of what we're thinking and hearing about now is, for example, involving more women as leaders, right? Or shifting the gender balance so that it's not so skewed towards men and it's more kind of equal, right? And then we hear about people who think about their gender and the way that they describe themselves as not fitting into this binary, you're either male or female. It's something different. And so we see that, and sometimes we might get an email, especially if we work in higher education, right? A very common thing now is in people's email signature file, they put what their preferred pronouns are. Mm-hmm. So, my preferred pronouns are he or whatever, based on how they like to be addressed, right? So these are the sorts of things that we're starting to see as indications. But what's interesting about this is that it's leading us towards a culture where this thing that used to be like the third question on a form, right? Like first name, last name, gender, right? That's how central it seemed, has now kind of become a question that allows people to make a statement about themselves that is different. Mm-hmm. So Facebook famously expanded their gender options from 2 to more than 50, to then 6 months later, more than 70, to then, even after that, an open write-in field. So now you can just write in whatever you want. And that's, I think, how fast this evolution is shifting. And so really what I talk about is, what does that mean for experiences or ways of communicating that used to be gendered, that don't need that gender in them? And there's some famous viral examples. I mean, there's a funny viral story of Bic that made a pen that was for women. and they got predictably slammed on social media and
right.
reviewed it on Amazon. And there's very funny reviews for this thing by all of these people who are like, finally, there's a pen for women because women can't just use any pen, right? Being sarcastic, of course.
Right.
So, I mean, there are stories like that about removing the gender, but there's also kind of the two angles of this. And these were two previously predicted trends that fit into this ungendering trend. And one of them was what we called fierce femininity, which is the role of women and how that's starting to shift in terms of the portrayal of women. And the other side of that was what we called muddled masculinity, which was this idea that men are in a real confusing moment right now, where they see all of these things about what it means to be a man, how that's shifting, how do I behave in a way that is positive, both towards women, but also just towards other people. And what does that mean for masculinity itself? And so, like, there's all these big questions out there. And so that's really what we tried to encompass in this one megatrend.
Well, definitely a lot of food for thought there. And I'll note again, that we've only talked about 3 of the mega trends here, on gendering, attention, wealth, and instant knowledge. Though I think I've also bled a little bit into some of the others. There are 10 of these. So, for listeners, we'll definitely have these noted on the show notes for this episode. But of course, the best source is the book itself, to go and find out about each of these 10 mega trends. And then, as we've discussed, the fact that you trace their origins back through the trends that you've identified over the past decade, and again, are very practical, very useful in how to put all of this together in a meaningful way, to use the process and to use the trends in your business environment. So, definitely recommend that to folks. And then I'd love to, and it's not so much shifting gears. I guess we'll evolve this conversation in much the way that I think I understand you're evolving non-obvious, and that the whole brand, the whole concept, and talk a little bit about where you're going at this point. And maybe as a start to that, I know at some point along the way, I can't remember exactly when this happened, but you got involved in publishing, and you actually launched your own publishing company, which is how you're now putting out non-obvious. As you go forward, what role does publishing play for you? And how do you think about the whole publishing industry now, and what can be done with a book, and how are you going to be combining that with other approaches as you go forward?
Yeah, so lots to unpack there. And I think, probably one of the most exciting things is, as I mentioned before, this is the last year that I'm doing this book. And so one of the big questions that a lot of people want to know is, look, if it was working and it's so successful, and it has been in terms of just driving a lot of the things that I do to go out there and educate people about this, why stop? And to me, the biggest reason was because I wanted to take this brand of non-obvious and this idea that we need more non-obvious thinking in the world and make it bigger than just this one book, this one annual book. And so instead of continually publishing this book about trends, the non-obvious brand is now encompassing an entire guidebook series that's meant to compete with these dummies guides that are out there. And one of the big motivations for that is something that I think will be really relevant and interesting for your listeners, which is the sense that the way that we want to learn anything now has shifted from what it used to be when the dummies guides were first created 20 plus years ago. Back then it was like, I'm just a dummy, like, just give me the stuff and I'll try and like figure it out myself. But like, I'm not really smart with this stuff. And now when you talk to people, that's not their perception. People actually believe they're pretty damn smart. They feel like they can work things out. They feel like they can Google stuff. They have instant answers. They have everything available at their fingertips. They can ask Alexa, they can ask Siri, and get these answers and figure stuff out. And so the mentality isn't so much, I'm just a dummy. The mentality is, I'm smart. And so the guides that we created, one of the ways we describe them is that it was smart advice for smart people. And we intentionally did that because the dummies guides, the idiots guides, that's the competition, right?
Right.
But the other thing we put in there, which really resonated with people, was that the tagline said that these books are written like having coffee with an expert. And that's the tone of it, right? So if you could sit down and pick the brain of a world-class expert on event planning or emotional intelligence or small business marketing, and ask them every question you wanted to ask about what should I never do? How would I waste money? What should I do instead? This would be a book that describes that. And so this guide series was created with that in mind. The first 5 of them are already out there in market. We have another 8 in production, and it's really starting to take off because that's the type of learning from a book, at least, that people want.
And I love that. I think it taps into, what for me has been a more or less conscious megatrend that I think everything we do here at Leading Learning and at Tagoras is guided by. And it's this whole notion of the empowered lifelong learner, because people are empowered now. As you just noted, they've got so much at their disposal. A lot of them are very good at using it. So, how do you help them create even more value out of that? And it sounds like that's really what you're tapping into going forward.
Yeah, exactly.
And I do have to ask, this is completely tactical, but and self-interested. But any plans for a podcast in there?
There are. Yeah.
All right.
And I will tell you that because it's going to be the non-obvious podcast, 2 little clues I will give you about the format of it. One is that it will not feature interviews.
Okay.
So no interviews. And the second is that every episode will be probably about 5 minutes long. That's the way that we're thinking about it. So more to come, but that's the idea behind it so far.
All right. Well, yeah, definitely let us know when that is out, and we will certainly help alert people to it. Well, as always, fantastic talking with you, Rohit. You're always up to so many interesting things, and we're at the point of the conversation where what is now the obvious thing for us to do is to ask you about a lifelong learning experience that has kind of transformed your life. We've actually asked you about that before, so I don't want to come back to that as a question again, but maybe a somewhat different angle on that to ask you about is, you're making this shift in what you're doing with the company. I'm assuming it's also impacting you personally, what you've learned over the years and what will now be taking forward. I know curation has just been so important to everything you do, and I assume it will continue to be. But do you have new practices beyond curation, or maybe it's a next level curation that you're going to be employing as part of your own lifelong learning in the I guess I shouldn't call it the post non-obvious world. I guess it's the next generation of the non-obvious world.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I have started to discover, and maybe this is related to just age, and getting a little older, but also related to learning, is that there isn't really anyone or anything that's inaccessible. There isn't really someone who, like, for example, if I read something, or you mentioned that as part of this, I'd started a publishing company. So I started a publishing company with my wife. So now I control the publishing company behind the book, right? And we've done 30 plus other books from other authors. And one of the fascinating things I realized as I started to do that is any book that you see in any bookstore, if I see a book and I say, oh, that cover is amazing, every single book lists the cover designer, and I can find out who that designer is. I can find out how to email him or her directly, and I can say, I've got a publishing company. Would you be able to work on one of our covers? And most of them will do freelance work. So my pool of designers, for example, to do a cover design is infinite, because every one of these designers does custom commission jobs, even the ones in full-time roles. And a lot of times just from a recruiting perspective, right? That's not a usual way to think, right? When you think, oh, they're already employed, like I can't hire that person. They're already doing something. They're already working on something, right? They work for someone else. They're inaccessible. And as soon as you take that out of your mindset and say, look, nobody's inaccessible. Like, what's the worst thing that'll happen? They'll say, sorry, I'm too busy, or sorry, I'm not allowed to do it right now. And so they say no, or they don't get back to you. But a lot of times what I've found is by putting that request out there, by making that connection happen, by being proactive, huge doors start to open. Now we have this pool of world-class book designers that are working with a small independent publishing house like ours instead of just, the huge publishers. And that, to me, has been a really fascinating thing that I have learned in the course of doing what I'm doing.
I love that. And I think that goes so well with what we were just saying a minute ago about empowerment that people feel smart, people feel empowered, and they also they have access to so much. And that obviously applies in a business context, as you were just illustrating, but also applies to learning as well. If you feel empowered, you recognize you've got the access, boy, the sky's really the limits. So that's fantastic perspective, I guess, to wrap up this conversation with and for listeners to take away. But before we totally wrap up here, we, of course, want to make sure that folks know how they can find you, how they can find the book, how they can keep track of everything non-obvious. So what are the best ways for them to do that?
So lots of ways. They should be able to find the book easily online and also in local bookstores. It'll also be in airport bookstores. So if you happen to be traveling and you go into a Hudson, you should be able to find it there. If you want to look online about the book, you can go to nonobvious.com/megatrends. And for anything about me, or if you want to watch like some videos of past talks that I've given or things like that, you can go to just rohitbhargava.com.
Well, great. Well, as always, it's been an interesting conversation. Certainly wish you the best of luck with the launch. I know this is going to be another successful capstone to the Non-Obvious series. And, in general, Rohit, thanks so much for taking the time to be on Leading Learning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That concludes the conversation with Rohit Bhargava. To get show notes, go to leadinglearning.com/episode 221. And the show notes will include the reflection questions. 1. How might the 3 megatrends highlighted in the episode, instant knowledge, attention wealth, and ungendering, impact your learning business? And 2, how are you leveraging and capitalizing on your best ideas? What might the results look like a decade from now?
When you check out the show notes, you'll also see the various options for subscribing to the podcast. And if you're getting value out of what you hear, we'd be truly grateful if you would subscribe, as it helps us to get some data on the impact of what we're doing.
We would also be grateful if you would take just a minute to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. Go to leadinglearning.com/Apple. That will put you in the right place. Jeff and I personally appreciate your rating and review, and reviews and ratings help the podcast show up when people search for content on leading a learning business.
Finally, consider following us and sharing the good word about Leading Learning in your social networks. You can find us on Twitter by going to leadinglearning.com/Twitter, on Facebook at leadinglearning.com/Facebook, and on LinkedIn at leadinglearning.com. You guessed it, LinkedIn. We also encourage you to use the hashtag #LeadingLearning on each of those channels. However you do it, please follow us and please help spread the word about Leading Learning.
Thanks again, and see you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.